The evening sky bled into shades of copper and wine as Elias Boone rode the narrow trail back from the cattle range, his chestnut gelding moving with the heavy rhythm of a long day. Dust rose around them, clinging to his boots, to the sweat-darkened saddle, to his very bones. Elias had grown used to the silence of these rides, to the absence of voices in his life. Years ago, when fever had taken his wife and the unborn child she carried, something inside him had hardened into stillness. The world still turned, neighbors still tipped their hats, but his own heart had grown quieter with every passing season, until he spoke to no one but the cattle and the sky. The gelding's ears flicked forward at a strange creak carried on the wind. Elias pulled the reins gently, scanning the thinning line of cottonwoods near the creek. The sound came again, sharp, like rope tightening under strain. He slid from the saddle, boots sinking into the dry earth, hand resting near the worn handle of his knife. The air seemed to hold its breath, cicadas falling silent as he stepped into the grove. Under the twisted branches of an old oak, he saw her, a girl, no older than 17, suspended by the wrists from a thick rope. Bare feet dangled, toes brushing the trunk, body limp but not lifeless. Around her neck hung a piece of weathered board, letters scrawled in black tar. "White man don't forgive." The sight rooted Elias to the ground. His pulse pounded, not from fear, but from a sudden shame that burned hotter than the desert sun. He had seen such cruelty whispered about in town, men taking their anger out on those who did not belong, but he had never stood in its path. Until now. Moving quickly, Elias drew his knife and cut the rope. The girl collapsed into his arms with a weight too slight for the bruises she carried. Her breath came shallow, but it was there, fragile as a candle's flame. He laid her on the grass, brushing the black strands of hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and guarded, fierce even through weakness. She did not speak, only studied him as though measuring whether he was savior or executioner. "You're safe," he murmured, though he doubted the words. His voice cracked from disuse, sounding foreign even to him. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back to his horse. The sign clattered to the ground, half buried in dust, and he let it lie. He wrapped her in his worn duster, mounted with care, and pressed his horse into a steady gallop toward the ranch. Each hoofbeat drummed louder than the last, echoing not only urgency, but a vow Elias had not known he was capable of making. She would not be left to die in the dark, not while his hands still held strength. The cabin on his land was a lonely place, but it offered shelter. He laid the girl on his narrow cot, lit a lantern, and set water to boil. His fingers trembled as he cleaned the rope burns on her wrists, the purple bruises along her shoulders. She winced but did not pull away. Her pride showed in the way she kept her gaze fixed, unflinching on his face. When he offered her a spoonful of broth, she turned her head at first. He did not insist, only set the bowl near her and stepped back. Later, when he turned to stoke the fire, he heard the faint clink of the spoon against the rim. Night pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, a fragile silence bound them. Elias sat near the table, hat resting in his lap, watching the flicker of lamplight trace across the girl's features. She was scarred, yes, but not broken. Something in her eyes reminded him of the stubborn will his wife once carried. The will to live, to endure. He felt the stir of an ache long buried, not romantic longing, but the painful memory of what it meant to care. At dawn, she tried to stand. Her knees buckled, and Elias moved instinctively to steady her. She brushed him off, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Without a word, she stepped outside into the crisp morning and sat in the dirt, face turned toward the sun. Elias let her be. He understood the need to prove strength, to not be pitted. That evening, he placed a folded blanket at the foot of her cot. She did not take it then, but when he rose the next morning, he saw it pulled tightly around her. By the third day, the town had learned. At the general store, whispers grew sharp enough to cut. "Boone's gone soft," a ranch hand muttered, harboring a savage girl after she near killed a settler's son. Another spat. Sign told the truth. "White man don't forgive, not for this." Their eyes followed Elias as he paid for flour and coffee, some filled with pity, others with suspicion. He spoke no defense, only tipped his hat and walked out into the sunlight. When he returned home, he found the girl at the door, as though she had heard every poisoned word. Her face was unreadable, yet her hands were clenched at her sides. Without speaking, she stepped past him and down the path, her stride unsteady but determined. Elias did not call after her. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, watching. A part of him feared she would vanish into the hills, and perhaps that would have been safer for them both. But after a few paces, she stopped. Slowly, she turned back. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. She returned, brushed past him, and sat again by the fire. Neither spoke. Words were too brittle, too likely to shatter the fragile understanding forming between them. Instead, their silence became a language of its own. When he brought in a pail of water, she took it from his hands without flinching. When she sliced bread that evening, she placed a piece on his plate without looking at him. Small gestures, yet each carried the weight of truce, of tentative trust. That night, Elias lay awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing across the room. The cabin no longer felt hollow. It carried another presence, fragile yet resolute. He knew the town's judgment would only grow harsher, that men like Harlan Pike would not let such defiance rest. But for the first time in years, Elias felt the stirrings of a purpose larger than himself. Protecting her was not only an act of mercy, it was a chance to reclaim the courage he had long abandoned. Outside, coyotes howled under the rising moon, their voices carrying across the open land. Inside the cabin, Elias closed his eyes and whispered into the dark. Not this time. It was not a promise to her, not even to himself, but to the memory of every moment he had looked away when cruelty took hold. The girl slept on, unaware of the vow spoken in the silence. And so the days began to turn, marked not by loneliness, but by a quiet bond that neither had asked for yet both seemed unwilling to break. The ranch, once a place of mourning, now held the fragile spark of defiance against a world eager to crush it. Elias Boone had rescued a stranger, but in doing so, he had also rescued a part of himself he thought long buried beneath dust and sorrow. The story of what would come next hovered in the air, waiting as if the land itself leaned in to listen. The days that followed stretched into a rhythm neither of them had expected. The girl, Ayoka, as Elias learned when she finally spoke her name in a whisper one quiet evening, moved about the ranch with deliberate determination. Though her body was still healing, she gathered eggs, stacked kindling, and sat by the corral watching the cattle as though memorizing the shape of the land itself. Elias never ordered her, never pressed her to do more than she chose. He simply showed her how to mend a strap, how to pour feed, how to light the fire so it would last through the night. Each gesture was met with silence at first, but silence softened to acknowledgement, and acknowledgement to something close to trust. Elias had not realized how empty his days had been until he heard her humming one dusk while carrying water from the creek. The sound startled him, low, melodic, carrying a rhythm unlike the hymns he knew from town. It drifted over the pasture like smoke, fragile but insistent. He paused mid-step, listening as the last rays of sun bled across the horizon. The song ended quickly when she noticed him, her expression tightening, but Elias only nodded. "It's good," he said softly. She looked at him for a long moment before turning away, though he thought he saw the faintest curve of something like relief on her lips. But the world outside their ranch was not blind. It was the sheriff who came first, riding up one morning with dust on his coat and unease in his eyes. Sheriff Galloway was a man Elias had known for years, a figure who carried the law as a burden rather than a weapon. Behind him rode Harlan Pike, broad-shouldered and sneering, with a young deputy trailing at his side. Their horses stamped the earth, impatient, as Elias stepped onto the porch with Ayoka standing just behind him. The sheriff's voice was heavy with warning. "Elias, folks are restless. They say you're sheltering the girl who killed a settler's son. They want her gone before trouble turns mean." Harlan spat into the dirt, adding with venom, or we take her off your hands and finish what we started. Elias felt Ayoka stiffen beside him, but she did not hide. Her eyes, dark and steady, locked on the men before her. Elias turned his gaze back to the sheriff. For a moment, silence stretched like a taut rope between them. Then, with a steadiness he had not known he still possessed, Elias said, "She stays. She's under my roof now, and anyone who tries to take her will answer to me first." The words hung in the air like thunder. Harlan's hand drifted toward the butt of his revolver, but the sheriff raised a cautioning palm. "This isn't done," Galloway warned, his voice low, almost weary. "But you've made your choice." With that, the three turned their horses and rode back toward town, leaving the ranch heavy with the weight of Elias's defiance. That night, Ayoka moved with restless energy, pacing the cabin as the fire flickered low. Elias watched her from his chair, finally speaking, "You don't have to stay. If you want to go, I won't stop you." She paused at the door, one hand resting on the frame, her silhouette caught in lamplight. For a long breath, she said nothing, then walked back to her cot and lay down her back to him. The answer was not in words, but in her presence. She had chosen to remain, despite the danger. Days later, the danger arrived. Elias saw the torches first, blooming on the horizon like false stars. Harlan Pike's men rode hard, their shouts carrying on the night wind. The ranch was soon ringed with fire and fury, horses stamping, rifles glinting. "Hand her over," they roared. "She don't belong here." Elias stepped outside, shotgun in hand. He did not raise it, not yet. The heat of the torches painted the mob in wild colors, anger etched on every face. Ayoka appeared at his side with a rifle clutched in her arms, defiance written in the set of her jaw. He glanced at her, shaking his head gently. She hesitated, then lowered the weapon, though she did not retreat. Elias spoke, his voice carrying over the restless horses and crackling flames. "You tried to hang her, but she lived. You thought to scare the land with your sign, but she breathes still. And as long as she does, I will stand with her. You'll not take her again." For a heartbeat, the mob wavered. Then a gunshot cracked, shattering the night. Elias fired once in return, his bullet grazing Harlan's arm, knocking him sideways in the saddle. Shouts erupted, torches waved, but no one pressed forward. Perhaps it was the sight of Elias Boone standing tall, or perhaps it was the way Ayoka stood beside him, unflinching in the firelight, that made their courage falter. One by one, riders turned their horses, curses fading into the distance until only smoke and silence remained. The fire on the horizon dwindled to embers. Elias lowered his shotgun, feeling the burn in his lungs, the sweat on his brow. His shirt was torn, his hand singed from a torch that had come too near, but the ranch still stood. Ayoka's breath trembled as she reached out, placing her hand on his. No words passed between them, yet the gesture carried more than speech could hold: gratitude, respect, and a bond forged in defiance. Inside the cabin, the night seemed quieter than it had in years. Elias sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over him. Ayoka moved about the room, settling the fire, pouring water, her movements steady despite the storm they had endured. When she finally sat across from him, their eyes met in silence. She was no longer simply a girl he had rescued from a tree. She was something else entirely, a presence that had shifted the course of his life. He spoke at last, voice rough but certain. "They'll talk. Let them. We'll live." Ayoka's gaze softened, and though she did not smile, the weight in her eyes seemed lighter. She drew the blanket around her shoulders, and for the first time, Elias felt the cabin was not a place of mourning but of survival, of beginnings. Outside, the stars stretched endless across the sky, vast and unbroken. The land had witnessed cruelty, but it had also borne witness to a stand, a refusal to bow to hatred. Under those stars, two souls scarred by loss and rejection sat in fragile peace, bound not by words, but by the simple act of remaining when it would have been easier to leave. Elias knew the days ahead would not be free of danger, that the town's judgment would not vanish with the smoke. But he also knew something else. For the first time since he buried his wife, he felt alive. He felt the stirrings of a purpose beyond the borders of his grief. Perhaps forgiveness was not given by men with torches or written on signs nailed to broken bodies. Perhaps it was born in the quiet choices, in standing when fear pressed hardest, in reaching for another hand, even when the world said to turn away. As the fire burned low and dawn whispered against the horizon, Elias understood that what had begun with a lonely ride under a dying sun had become something larger. And so the night ended not in silence, but in a fragile, unspoken vow between a weary rancher and a scarred young woman. They would endure,